Today I'm talking about A Tale of Two Cities, some reflections on recent work I've been doing, looking at digital technology and the natural environment. So just a little bit about myself. As Peter said, my formal title is Distinguished Professor of Distributed Systems at Lancaster University. And you might be sitting there asking, why is a professor of distributed systems talking to us about sustainability? And that may be a very good question to be asking. But I guess the answer is further down this slide, because it doesn't take too much of a data science algorithm to spot a change point in the slide here between what's at the top and what follows down below. You know, massive change point in my own personal career. I can always remember how that came about. I was actually taken to the cinema on my birthday, which is something we often do. I'm a big cinema goer, enjoy many films, and we went to see a film called Chasing Ice, which is a film about the beauty of ice in the Arctic and the use of technology to capture how that ice is disappearing. And I remember sitting that film with, actually with tears rolling down my cheeks. I hadn't cried at the cinema since I last went to see E.T., so it was a bit of a surprise to me. But that film had a very profound impact on me. What it actually did for me personally is it turned climate change from being a head issue, something I was intellectually interested in, curious about and kind of wanting to do something about, to being a heart issue. But I really felt it. I felt the urgency. And it wasn't a case of wanting to do something about it, it was needing to do something about it. So what I did as an academic, and this will mirror your own experiences for many of you, what I did is I changed my career round. I switched my career round, so I applied the skills I have, which are as a computer scientist, which are as a distributed systems researcher. I turned it round, so I applied these technologies for what I would call the social good, and in particular to address issues around climate change. And that led to what you then see below. I was very lucky just after that to be able to bid for and be successful with an EPSRC Senior Fellowship, which is a 5-year program with a substantial research grant to look at this area. And that has really created the backdrop to what I'm talking about today. And I've been able to recruit a marvelous team to work with me, as I'll talk about shortly. I've also got a very strong relationship. In fact, I'm now a senior fellow in the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology, and I help run a new Centre of Excellence in Environmental Data Science. And I'm a part-time shepherd. That's just an excuse to have a very nice picture of a lamb in this first slide. So I can't see you, unfortunately, but you look like quite a literary bunch. We've already seen some quite impressive backdrops, some bookshelves in various Zoom sessions. So I can tell you're a literary bunch. So many of you will be aware of this book, one of the great English classics by Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities. And I'm kind of using this for inspiration because it tees up very nicely my reflections and thoughts on digital technology and the natural environment. I'm just going to read the first bit of this. What marvelous prose. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. And so it continues. What marvelous prose, which was written during the French Revolution or about the French Revolution. that seems to apply to so many eras since, including the era we're in right now. So I'm using that marvelous quote to frame the rest of the keynote. We start off with the season of light, and also illustrated by one of Munch. These great images. If anybody wants an interesting discussion with me over coffee, you could ask me why I'm not going to be sued for using that Munch image or the other ones. There's something to tee up a conversation later. I've learned an awful lot in the last 5 years. I've worked with environmental scientists from many different disciplines, and it's been a fascinating journey. I've worked with climate scientists, hydrologists, soil scientists, people working in natural capital. I've observed them at work, I've worked with them, I've iterated with them, I've shared beers with them, and so much learning. But what I've really learned is how much their world has changed over the past decade. You know, historically, environmental scientists, like many of us used to be, were incredibly siloed. You could be a specialist in something really specific and study that really, really specific aspect of the natural environment for years and years. I've seen people study a meter cube of soil and study worm life in a meter cube of soil for large parts of their career. And that's very worthy because it's good science. But that's not the science that's been funded. It's not the research questions that have been asked. What people are asking now are incredibly big research questions that span whole ecosystems, that look at the complexity of the natural environment and ask questions like, how do we manage this under climate change? How do we manage this in a 1.5 degree world? How do we manage this in a 2 degree world? Actually, what world are we heading to with our current trajectories? What do we do with our water systems? How do we preserve the water quality? Massive questions. And they don't have the tools to do it as yet. There's also a big shift because they have an incredible amount of data. They, as many people, are moving into the world of big data. With a difference, because their data is highly complex, highly heterogeneous, and at different scales. So the integration of that data is particularly challenging. And they're not data scientists. And there's a danger they drown in this sea of data. So big questions, big opportunities, but not necessarily the tools to do anything about it. There are a group of scientists in shock because of the lack of trust in environmental science, and they really struggle with that and addressing the whole issue of trust, and are looking for new ways of rebuilding trust. And one of the things they're looking at is open science, more transparent approaches, reproducible science, and that's a big challenge to them. And then finally, they're having to communicate the issues they have on the planet, for the very survival of the planet. They know that, and they have to find better ways of communicating. And that's a big challenge. So just step into their world and imagine what it's like. Major upheaval. They need to find new ways of doing science. So what's the role of digital technology in all this? And I don't want to oversell it. I'm not going to say at all that digital technology is some savior. It's a piece of the jigsaw. And the piece of the jigsaw I'm particularly interested in. Now, we all have our favorite digital technologies. The ones I worked in as a distributed systems researcher historically have actually proved to be quite useful. I start off with the Internet of Things. You know, the Internet of Things, we all have our favourite story of some useless intervention that can come about from the Internet of Things, and I'm not even going to repeat them here. There's many examples. The Internet of Things could really be very helpful in understanding what's going on in the natural environment, to have dense deployments of sensors around catchments, albeit with the issues around waste and pollution. But there could be a rich source of data to give very fine-grained temporal spatial data to understand catchments, to understand water quality, soil health going forward. So the Internet of Things has real potential in this area. Cloud computing is really, really important, because if there's anything in a complex world, it's the need to bring things together. Integration is crucial for the future of environmental science. Many scientists talk about the long tail of science, where most of the data is not in central facilities, but on desktops and laptops and curious corners of labs, unable to be shared. The ability to bring all this data together in one place is really profound and should not be underestimated. Cloud computing can do that and has the elastic capacity to process this data. Then there's making sense of this data. You have highly complex data, highly heterogeneous data at different scales. How do you make sense of this data? It gets to the point, and we're working on some data sets at the moment which are really rich, and the environmental scientists cannot, by observation, make sense of this data. It needs to be at least partially automated. Data science and AI are some of the biggest areas of innovation in computer science at the moment. What is a data science of the natural environment? What does that look like? That surely must be really important. And then finally, I'm going to throw in a fourth one that might surprise you in this list. There's so much of environmental science is about communication and decision-making, leading to hopefully well-informed mitigation adaptation decisions around a changing climate. Can digital actually inspire new forms of communication? And I'll come back to that in a segment in the talk, digitally inspired communication. So I think this is quite an exciting agenda. It's something that has really, really got me excited over the last few years. And it's what I'm looking at in the season of light, the positive side of technology and nature. So as I say, I have my fellowship, and thank you Research Council UK, thank you EPSRC, who are just down the road from Bristol, for giving me this opportunity. And we've set up a research group. You can see the URL there if you like to have a look. And we're looking at the role of digital technology. I use the term digitally inspired, integrated environmental science. And we're able to look at some big issues. Because it's a fellowship, we can look at big issues and ask big questions, and we have a 5-year timescale to really think about that. So the approach we took is rather unusual, and let me do an advert for Emily's talk, which happened yesterday and will be repeated this afternoon. I think it's session F from memory. Which talks about the methodology we approached. It's very difficult to do anything in this sphere because it's so big and complex and there's so many dimensions to it. The approach we decided to take was to look at 4 different issues over 4 years, with a little bit of padding in between for reflection and consideration and reshaping. So we've looked at 4 issues. We've looked at flooding, biodiversity and soil, and we're about to move on to ecosystem services next year. So we've looked at 4 separate issues, which means a year on each. And then we're looking at the big cross-cutting questions around complexity and uncertainty across all of these. So you can think of vertical slices through this space. Now that means we have a year to study something, and what we brought in is agility as a research method, agile methods applied to research, and we build a community around us of scientists and stakeholders. We work with them very closely, we iterate, we reflect, we try things out on them, we discuss with them, and we have a journey and a narrative together. And that then leads to some outputs, which are hopefully by the end co-designed. And that's precisely what Emily's talk will be about, so I won't say any more about that. Very interesting experience. Obviously positives and negatives working in that way. Go to Emily's talk if you want to discuss this in more detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick out some highlights. I'm going to go through this one relatively quickly because this is the case study that Emily features, and then I'm going to spend a little bit more time on other case studies. So the first work we did was on flood risk management, and that was very timely. The fellowship kicked off at precisely the same time as Storm Desmond, which had a devastating effect on many parts of the UK. It took out Lancaster for many weeks because we were stupid enough to build a power station by the banks of a river. So no electricity for many weeks. That power station is now probably one of the most protected power stations in the UK. So flooding seemed very timely, and it's obviously a massive critical issue around climate change, one of the most obvious visible things that we see and have to deal with. What we wanted to do in this experiment was work closely with scientists and practitioners in this area and look at the issue of data, what they're doing with more data. This diagram is one of my favourite diagrams because it shows the current state of the art and where the flood risk management community want to get to. And it's out of the National Flood Resilience Review that followed Storm Desmond. Traditionally, what's happened is what's there in the topmost part of this diagram, the part that shows the integrated simulation pathway. Scientists in general, environmental scientists in general, work with what they call process models, which are scientific models, perhaps with differential equations at their heart that represent different processes. So for example, on the left at the top, there's one for the global weather system, effectively climate models, then local weather, then hydrology, the kind of physics of hydrology and flow, then inundation and impact and so on. The challenge there and the challenge that's captured in this diagram is how you integrate all these, how you get them to work together, and that itself is a massive challenge. At the bottom, we have something quite new. We have data. And the world of hydrology has changed massively with availability of data. And this is a good illustration of how it's all becoming so heterogeneous. You have satellite data, you have much more satellite data. There's satellites being launched all the time, giving more and more and more and more data to environmental scientists. Quite a lot of it will never be looked at because the volume is so high. You have citizen science data, which is invaluable. Citizens going out and recording events, posting photographs. That data is invaluable to give you precise measurements of where floods actually reached at a given point in time. Rich data. You have environmental agency reports. They commission reports and they go out and they write very detailed reports, which actually sit in their filing cabinets. Absolutely bonkers. The data in that is not available to modelers. You have the insurance industry that knows exactly what's happened and where the damages occurred, if people are fortunate enough to be insured, of course. Rich data, it's all over the place. Some of it's digital, some of it's not integrated. You can't interrogate that data as a scientist as a single thing. So what we did is we worked with them and we understood this problem over time, and what we eventually finished up building is what we called a data hypercube. using semantic web technologies and classic cloud technologies. The interesting thing about this experiment is that the computer science was relatively mundane, easy to build because there's so many tools out there. So it was a rapid prototyping exercise. A rapid prototyping exercise that reused so many rich services that are available in the modern cloud environment. So we built this and we tried it out iteratively and stepped towards this. This was a journey and a narrative, not a classic implementation. And the work has been very influential and is likely now, I can't say too much because there's contracts being negotiated, but it's likely to strongly influence future directions of natural flood management in the UK going forward. And there's a paper just about to come out on this work if you're interested in more. So that was really interesting. That was dipping our toe in the water and really understanding the major problems of environmental science. There's one problem left hanging there, which those of you are really sharp this morning, which I'm sure there's quite a lot of you out there. What do you do with the data understanding and the process understanding? How do they combine? And I'll come back to that. So moving on, end of the year, new workshop, new set of people, and biodiversity being the topic. Completely different community, completely different cultures, completely different ways of thinking, as if it was a different planet. This time I'm going to feature one where we actually found, with the flood work, we found that the flood community spoke with one voice, and we kind of figured out what they wanted and worked with them and came up with one thing. With the biodiversity sprint, it was much more, it wasn't almost not a community. We were finding we were introducing people to each other through the medium of our workshops, and technology was something that was bringing them all together that hadn't met before. So it's a completely different world. So we finished up mirroring that in some ways and doing a lot of different areas of innovation, generally around the question of how do we address the issue of scarcity of data and biodiversity. Complete opposite. With the flood risk work, too much data. In this community, suddenly not enough, really patchy, much more difficult to get rich data, for example, about bee populations and the context in which that lead to maybe some decline in bee populations. Much, much harder. So I'm going to feature one project here, which is the lost sounds, which starts to touch on why I think communication is so important and how we can look at digitally inspired communication. And I kind of want to acknowledge here the work of Liz Edwards, who's a designer in my team. My team consists of environmental scientists, computer scientists, data scientists, social scientists, artists and designers. And it's really valuable to have creative disciplines involved so intrinsically in the work. So the Lost Sounds project was all about inspiring people to be interested in nature. And going back to Peter's comment, drawing people in to be more connected to nature, particularly young people. The number of people that would call themselves naturalists, or even people that would call themselves connected to nature, is dwindling dramatically. They simply won't be naturalists of the future. So what we were trying to do was to get people excited about nature, observing nature, being mindful of nature, and perhaps in the future inspiring them to be digital naturalists. And we did that through the Lost Sounds project. So what we did with Lost Sounds, what Liz did was she would run workshops with school kids. She would take them out into what was Morecambe Bay, area of rich bird life. And they would observe and they would look for birds. They would draw sketches of them. They would listen for sounds, they would record them, they would observe little stories, narratives, they would collect that, and then they would go back to the classroom. And then they would each draw some of their birds, and you can see a drawing there. And the ink there is conductive ink, and then they would connect them up to Arduino behind the surface, and they would program. They would do some coding, some directed coding, and then the end result is a kind of incredible thing of great beauty that has certainly taken some schools aback, and parents aback when they see what's been created. So I'm just going to play a short video clip. This is the end result from one of these projects. So I think that is marvellous. It's a real highlight for me from what we've done so far. And I'm talking too much as always, so I don't have too much time to dwell in this, but I'm very passionate about the arts and the role of the arts in communication, particularly digital inspired arts. And we've had the opportunity to work with Liz, yes, and there's more of examples of her work on the left. And also we have artists in residence, Somewhere Nowhere, who did some of the work in the middle. And then Claire Dean, who is a writer who works with digitally inspired forms that transcend the book. And the example there is someone walking about Lancaster with a map, and it's recreating Persephone's footsteps, reimagining that classic tale. And the higher you go, the more you step out through the underworld and through the city pollution caused by climate change. Really terrific, terrific work. And more images there. So I just want to conclude this part of the talk with just talking about what we're doing now. What we're doing now is really tackling one of the core issues that's come out over the future of environmental science, and it's how you combine data understanding with process understanding, and we're doing that in the context of understanding soil health. The key issue here is how you combine two worlds, not the two cities, two worlds. Come back to the two cities in a second. Some people think, and there's sometimes an arrogance from the computing community, some people think that AI will be the answer. You just collect all your data together and you analyze the data, you throw it into deep learning algorithm, and out will come understanding. And hence we'll be able to resolve issues of climate change. That's wrong. That is a wrong statement. And it's wrong for very important reasons. Science is all about understanding process. If data tells you the answer, you won't understand the process. The processes are captured in climate models and other models, including models of soil, which are the very bedrock of environmental science. So you really need to pull these two worlds together. That is critical. It's the biggest challenge, it's the grand challenge that's coming out of the fellowship, and it's what we're working on now. And this is an architecture of what we're working on now, which is completely hot off the press. It's actually the first time I've even tried to draw this. And at the bottom, we have a data cauldron where we throw all the data in that we can collect in all its messiness and all its complexities, and we let it bubble away. And yes, we apply machine learning techniques there, typically quite primitive ones, to look for trends and patterns and insights. The most important part of this diagram, though, is my rather bad drawing of people in the middle, scientists in the middle. This has to be interpreted by science. It's not an automatic process. Some of these trends will be complete nonsense. Some of them will be real surprises. Like, did you know, soils give out more CO2 in the middle of the afternoon? Why? New science. And that then requires maybe going to the process models to understand that more, maybe to put things into process models because there's processes that are missing. It's this rich interaction, it's the animation of this diagram that's important, not any one part. So we're working on this. We actually call it a digital twin of the soils. And I think that's really exciting work, touching on what we now feel is one of the critical issues to be cracked, how these two worlds collide. So I'm going to move on now in the interest of getting to time for discussion. And I'm going to suddenly go very glum, change demeanor, and say we're all doomed, the season of darkness. I'm not going to spend too long on this because actually much more work in this community. You know, in some ways, a lot more about this than I do. There's been so many great papers at ICT4S, and let me acknowledge that and applaud this great work that, you know, no doubt some people in the audience will have worked on. I started doing some work on this as a kind of side project in my fellowship, and I got involved with Small World Consulting. And actually, thank you, Chris Priest, who may be present, for making this happen. The Small World Consulting includes the person who leads Small World Consulting is Mike Berners-Lee. I've actually got his book here. I shouldn't really be doing adverts in the middle of keynotes, but There Is No Planet B, which is his latest book, which is keeping him very busy. So we got together and we started working on the carbon emissions of ICT, you know, well rehearsed in this community, as I say. If you look, what we didn't do new studies, we looked at what was out there and then tried to interpret it. If you look at the studies that are out there, there's quite a lot of variability. Some of that comes from different assumptions and different scopes. But roughly, it looks as if the ICT emissions of technology is running somewhere between 1.8 and 2.8% of global emissions, which pushes it just above the airline industry. Our feeling, and we want to do more work in this and hoping to capture this in a forthcoming paper, our feeling is that's an underestimate because not all studies look at the full supply chain of technology from cradle to grave. For example, the embodied cost of technology, and some deem some areas out of scope that are actually becoming really important and quite dominant. For example, blockchain, and more so in the future, IoT. So the actual figure could be a lot higher, and that's somewhere between 2.1 and 3.9%. So that started to become really, really significant. ICT's carbon footprint is a problem, full stop. I like to capture it in this diagram. This is a kind of a classic tug of war that often happens in English village squares, probably around June time, actually, in July. And what this shows, I think, is the way forward and where this is heading. And there's certain pressures pulling in one direction, which is to reduce carbon emissions, and there's other pressures pulling in the opposite direction. Where is this going? So let's unpick this a little bit more. First of all, there's been some truly impressive efficiency gains, particularly around data centers, and these should be acknowledged. You know, data centers may be flattening out because of efficiency gains, particularly with some of the hyper data centers, the hyperscale ones that have been built recently that benefit from scale. Energy gains are positive. As is the switch to renewables that's happening, assuming these renewables are actually additionality and not just taking renewables that could be used elsewhere, because renewables are finite as well in their construction. So powerful forces pulling that way. And also the well-known enablement arguments that yes, of course, we're saving in other sectors. For example, right now, we're saving massively, but not flying and doing conferences over Zoom. So all very positive. On the other side, are we actually now seeing the end of Moore's law? That is quite possible. We cannot keep relying on Moore's law forever. I'm particularly interested in the bit in the bottom, so I'll pick that up. Carbon hungry innovations, IoT. There's a talk yesterday touched on this, the sheer massive rise in the number of devices out there, and particularly here the embodied carbon behind all these devices. That is a threat. Your cloud computing and data centers is a threat just because of the rise of big data, with big data doubling every 2 years. These are big increases. Can the efficiency gains continue? AI and data science. There's not a lot of very sophisticated studies out there of the carbon emissions related to AI, and I think there needs to be more. The sheer wastefulness of an AI algorithm is a concern. And then finally, of course, blockchain. We all know blockchain, and it's rather depressing to me that computer science, particularly distributed systems, invented an algorithm like blockchain and didn't even consider the fact that this is carbon hungry. And then, of course, there's Jevons paradox, which I think is quite critical here. Throughout history of climate change, we have had efficiency gains lead to nothing because they're gobbled up by doing more. It's very likely that Jevons paradox applies in this area as it's applied across many sectors of the economy. Where is this heading? I don't know. Let's discuss. Open point of discussion. I have concerns that there's real risk here. Just a final note. According to Paris, carbon emissions have to plummet, as shown in that diagram. Are they plummeting? No. The best case assumption for ICT, and this is highly optimistic, is that we're flattening out. Flattening out is not plummeting. We're miles away from where we have to be in 2050, as Greta Thunberg keeps reminding us. How dare you prescribe some technical solutions? Very profound words. How will this end? I'm coming to the end of my talk now, so how do I end but go back to Charles Dickens? How does the book Tale of Two Cities end? Well, it kind of ends in chaos. It's not very positive. You know, the French Revolution is a pace. There's chaos, there's uncertainty, as there is today. Where are we heading? But out of that chaos, there's a nice twist at the end. Sidney Carton, who is one of the key characters in the field, has had a miserable life and then a miserable end because his head was chopped off. He finished off with these imagined words, his final thoughts, before the guillotine came down. And it's a twist of hope. It is a far, far better thing that I do than I've ever done. It is a far, far better rest than I go to than I have ever known. A hint of hope. A hint of hope that I feel at the moment. We've got a unique opportunity. I love the work, for example, of Build Back Better. ICT, please build back better. We have a one moment in history to get this right, perhaps a glimpse of hope. Remember that what happened after the French Revolution was a period of enlightenment. Is there a period of enlightenment round the corner? It's our last chance. I can think of no better way of ending than that. Thank you to so many people who have helped me, and I'm ready now to move on to questions.
Gordon, thank you very much indeed. A really kind of thoughtful presentation, and interesting about your own personal journey, as well as some of the insights that you are now coming out with. So it would be great if people would like to contribute to the conversation. either through Slack under the section that says 2020 Keynote Gordon, or if you can't access Slack for whatever reason, then do use the Q&A on this webinar. So I think just one or two comments immediately come in. If we look at the Tale of Two Cities and the downside, you are highlighting and concerned about the potential and actual carbon footprint of ICT. Just one or two comments have come in, and just want to sort of explore that a little bit further, partly as to whether that's overstated as a worry. And I've got Vlad and Pernilla have, and you can probably see it on Slack as well, just suggesting that that maybe the ICT carbon footprint isn't as great an issue and a problem as maybe you are concerned about. I'm just interested to get your further thought on that, given all the wonderful things and possibilities and ways of reducing carbon that ICT enables. Not least, look at this wonderful moment of us on a Zoom. Just wonder if you want to just explore a little bit further your level of concern about the kind of carbon footprint of ICT.
Yeah, you can't answer that question by looking at the bigger picture of climate change. Yeah, it's the biggest crisis of our time, even notwithstanding the current pandemic. I still don't think people have woken up to how serious it actually is. I work every day with climate scientists, soil scientists, water scientists. They're all really, really deeply concerned. I can't overstate how worrying it is to have knowledge and not being able to get that message across. So carbon emissions generally have to be addressed. As that slide on actually meeting Paris indicates, ICT is not immune from that. ICT has to be responsive. It has to respond. We have to pull down the carbon emissions of ICT. Now, I've spent a lot of time reading the various papers that have come out of the ICT4S community, so I know there'll be people in the audience that say, yes, I've overstated it. And there'll also be people in the audience that say I've understated it. That actually the problem is the carbon emissions are going up. Even the most optimistic, I would like to maybe get back to the people who've asked the question. I would imagine they would be saying that ICT emissions are flattening out. That's not good enough. If ICT emissions flatten out and we project forward to 2050 and we don't start to really, really reduce the emissions, then ICT becomes a bigger and bigger slice of the pie. That's simple maths. So I think we have a responsibility to really, really reduce and look for every opportunity. My concern is that with the trends that we talked about, like IoT, billions and billions of devices being created, there is embodied carbon in these devices. There's no way of getting away from that. Deep learning algorithms do not come for free. What does an energy efficient deep learning algorithm look like? Making sure that any efficiency gains here are not gobbled up by Jevons paradox. These are big, big questions that we have to address and take seriously.
So I think what I take from your response there is obviously there's a discussion to be had, an analysis to be had, but we can't sort of duck it. We need to be centrally in that, wrestling with that debate, because obviously there's another dimension of the extraordinary power of ICT to, as someone said, to increase our capacity to produce, consume, and acquire resources. So we're actually bound up in what it enables us to do in terms of acquiring stuff, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And I'm just looking at one or two other sort of questions around that. Interesting. Someone's just said, is the problem that technology is massively, it says, deployed with too little purpose stroke design. So it's amazingly used,
Yeah.
but too little thought about, purpose and design. Would you go along with that?
Yeah, I'm going to cite one of my good friends, John Crowcroft, who I always meet each year at Glastonbury, actually. John Crowcroft is a professor of computing at Cambridge, and he gave a fantastic keynote at Data for Policy last year where he talked about the hype cycle, which I think is a worrying trend in computer science. We over-promote technologies, and AI, blockchain, and IoT are classic examples. We really push these technologies before they almost exist in some cases, and we get people excited, and you have to embrace IoT or blockchain in your future business without asking, hold on, why? What's the purpose? Can we not start by really understanding the societal need here and derive the solution that meets the needs of society going forward? So I agree completely with the sentiment behind that great question.
And just, I want to focus on other parts of your talk and some questions coming through, but there's a very specific question from Elena Eriksson saying,
Hi, Elena.
I think the data versus process bit was really interesting. What do you think we as computer scientists need to learn more about to address this? Do we need to change our practice stroke research? And if so, how?
Yeah. Well, actually, I'm not the last bit of the question I'll maybe need to think about, but what is computer science? Computer scientists have a lot to offer here. The diagram I showed of the digital twin had some boxes and arrows, all the actions in the arrows. It's not in the boxes. The boxes were things like process models, data cauldrons, data emulators, and so on. It's the interactions between them and the people in the middle. And I think computer science as a discipline actually is quite sophisticated in how we deal with the people in the middle and how we deal with interactions between entities. I think as a subject matter, we've got a lot to bring to that. There's also quite a lot around the whole adaptive debate, like one of the key interactions, for example, between a process model and the data world is things like adaptive sampling. Perhaps a process model is coming up with some solutions about what it thinks is happening in soil health and realizes there's massive uncertainties in a key part that would help resolve equations. So asks for more data from a particular region so it can drive data gathering strategies. So that whole world of adaptive and the scale from adaptive to autonomous and the role of people in the loop is something computer science has a lot to offer.
Okay, interesting. A question coming in from Benoit Combermal, saying, a question for Gordon: all sustainability problems are wicked problems.
Yes.
Like inadequacy of problem solution pairs when used to identify and address complex issues in such situations. Yes. Digital technologies seem not well suited currently to deal with the wicked problems, weak uncertainty management, etc. Any thoughts on this and how to make progress on the digital technologies we are developing?
Thank you, Benoit, for that easy one.
You're
absolutely right.
In the morning.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I like the writings of Steve Easterbrook here on complexity and systems thinking. Yeah, again, the question sort of comes from a perspective that technology is the answer. What's the problem? But if you actually start with a wicked problem and apply systems thinking to that problem, then you may have an opportunity to work from the problem down and then fit technology in that picture. It's part of the motivation why we don't do classical software engineering and go away. In the work we do, we don't capture requirements, sit in the lab and build something and then come back a year later and say, is this what you mean? To which the answer is almost inevitably no. That, because it's a wicked problem and because it's a transdisciplinary problem and we need communication and new tools to feel our way into this problem, it's why we use Agile as a research method. It's our attempt, and it's not the only attempt. Systems thinking as well is very, very important. There's some data about that this year in the conference as well.
Just an interesting, direct question here coming from Emily Winter. She says, in terms of maximizing the environmental benefits of ICT and minimizing the downsides, just your thoughts on some of the solutions. Do we need stronger regulatory frameworks? Lots more conferences discussing it, or something else? How do we, and also given that, we had David Ferguson yesterday put up on the screen the number of days we have less left in order to dramatically change the trajectory. What's your insights about what we kind of need? Because we seem to be nudging slightly slowly in vaguely the right direction.
Yeah, well, nudging slowly is not good enough. It's nowhere near good enough. We had lots of debate about this at the end of the work, or it's ongoing with Mike Berners-Lee, but what's actually needed now. What is it? Is it regulation? I'm a big believer that ultimately it has to come down to carbon tax and economics to drive things, but I'm also a big believer that this comes bottom up. I think as computer professionals, we're responsible. Let me tee up the keynote tomorrow and do an advert for Marina, who's a good friend of mine. She'll be talking about responsible innovation with a very provocative talk. Is it time for a responsibility revolution? Yes.
Right.
I think it, so you don't have to go to the talk now, there's the answer. But computer science innovations are traveling so fast and are so powerful and have such a profound impact in the world in a relatively short space of time. We are responsible and have to be responsible for that. So there may be economic approaches, there may be regulatory approaches, but ultimately it comes down to the responsibility of each and every one of us. So I think the real answer must come from a bottom-up approach. And I'm actually really encouraged to see so many initiatives stemming up, including this conference, that's promoting a more responsible innovation with respect to nature and actually with respect to the other wicked problems we face in society.
Okay. In the early part of your talk, you were talking about this this kind of cauldron and the bringing together of the data understanding and process understanding. And also, in a sense, it's bringing, because of the complexity of nature and the systems, bringing different disciplines together. And there was a very interesting conversation yesterday about the challenges of interdisciplinary working. And I'm just, I get the idea that we all need to connect this together, and we will develop and build thoughtful responses. The challenge is that the institutions, the structures we have, often work in the opposite direction. And I'm just interested in yes, it's great that we make these connections, but do we need to make changes? And if so, how, in order that professionals and stakeholders in these fields kind of find ways to join around the cauldron? Because it seems that we are a specialist silo world that seems to resist this. So how do we make this happen in the real world?
Yeah, well, one thing we're exposing, one thing I could have talked about in great depth, but that would have been maybe a different talk, is the role of virtual laboratories. We do a lot of work on virtual labs. In fact, the data cauldron is one instance of that. Virtual labs are cooperative, integrative environments in the cloud, which the cloud is well suited to, really building on some of the great work that was done in e-science. So let's bring together data and models in the cloud in one place as cooperative environments. And what you're actually doing there is not bringing together the data per se. You're bringing together the data owners. You're bringing together the people, and you're creating a conversation in the cloud. And that's the important bit. You're getting the different disciplines to come together and look at the integrative data from different perspectives, the recording of thoughts and their experiments in notebook technologies, which is another mundane technology. It's incredibly powerful in this sphere. You can see prior experiments that maybe a biogeochemist has done, and you can pick them up and look at it and maybe combine it with your perspective as a water quality expert. You start to get that transdisciplinary dialogue happening by bringing things together and creating a medium. So virtual labs are a very big part of the work we do.
And, I mean, a lot of science and activity is driven by funding and all the rest of it. I mean, are there changes? I mean, obviously there is an encouragement towards more greater sort of interdisciplinary working. Are there more things that strategically we as society should be doing to encourage, force, or whatever a greater move in this direction, or do we just kind of let it happen because it makes sense?
No, it won't just happen. And, obviously, there's things we should be doing. Actually, in the UK context, the timing has never been better, curiously enough. There's been certain moves that have favoured research in this direction. The research councils have all had their heads knocked together. There's no longer an engineering and physical sciences research council in isolation. I believe, you'll know as you work for them, they're all pulled under a UKRI banner. They're all under one banner, all disciplines together, all research together. And they've created these big themes, grand challenge themes, which require transdisciplinary approaches. I work very closely with one of these, which is constructing a digital environment, which is bringing together technology and the natural environment. There's large sums of money being given out to researchers to investigate this transdisciplinary space because of this move. That's a move in the right direction. I attended a workshop last week on Zoom, run by UKRI, about sustainable futures in the digital economy, massive transdisciplinary space. So actually, curiously, funding in the UK is moving in the right direction. That may not be true in all parts of the world. It almost certainly isn't in many parts of the world, but we're very fortunate that we've got the opportunity now to really do some rich work in this area.
Just interesting also, again, a central part of your talk was about communication. We've obviously got all this amazing capacity for data analysis and the bringing in of the arts. So it's hearts and minds. It's people almost having an epiphany moment. And kind of, I suppose, a lot of my work is about how we get just beyond just using our brains to actually feeling these issues and transformational and connecting. And again, it still feels anathema to serious science and all the rest of it. And I'm wondering, whether you're encountering a kind of pushback, the art side is sort of trivializing what you're doing, and B, how we make a breakthrough that this becomes a thing of the soul, of the heart, as well as the brain. Of
course, my passion comes directly from my own personal experience. I'm sitting here because of a piece of art. The people that made Chasing Ice, the key individual behind it, was an environmental scientist, an environmental modeler who get fed up by having no impact whatsoever on the world. through building better and better models of ice sheet melt. So I turned to cinema, and it reduced me to tears, and it was my epiphany moment, without overstating it, that led me to do the work I do now. So it worked for me. As you say, it can really get to the soul. It's what the science is failing to do. So have I had received resistance? No, absolutely not. I think scientists are frustrated that their voice is not getting out there. They've realized they've done a bad job of communication, to be honest. You know, one classic example is uncertainty. Yeah, if you talk to an environmental scientist for more than 5 minutes, they'll talk about uncertainty in their models. And of course they're uncertain. They'll actually focus on the uncertainty. And that can be picked up by the press, and, you know, maybe to twist it to say, well, it's uncertain. It's actually not uncertain. Climate change is not uncertain. It's a certainty, it's a fact. But that whole debate has gone badly wrong. You know, how do you work with these different creative disciplines to, you know, really hit the heart and minds? People have really embraced that because they know it's a weak spot in the subject. They might not know how to do it. They might still love their uncertainty bands and their graphs and their time series analyses outputs, but they know they have to communicate better.
And
so
I suppose by its nature, that the whole research scientific process is one that tends to be hesitant rather than risk-taking, qualifying everything all the way through, and that then in translation it kind of doesn't work with wider society. We're coming towards the end of our immediate time, but there's a fascinating stream of thoughts on the Slack, and if you're able in that Slack time when you could have been listening to whoever it is on the pyramid stage, it would be great if you were able to kind of just follow one or two of the things up. And just to say, Rosanna's put a point on the Slack that if you're following and responding to a comment, and this is for everyone, if you can reply to that comment and keep a thread rather than just add something at the bottom, it allows us to get a little bit of a thread of conversation. But I just wanted to come back to something really personal, and personal to you, Gordon. I mean, a lot of the people in on this call are young researchers, academics who've managed to with grappling hooks get into an institution and have managed to get funding and are doing their bit, and hanging on in there is quite a challenge at the moment. And I'm just would just like a couple more words from you, that it feels as though you've transformed yourself. When you get up in the morning, you're almost, you're taking a risk, you're being bold, you've changed your whole approach. A lot of us are nervous about doing that, for whether it's for financial, we don't want to rock the institutional boat, or it feels comfortable, just carry on because I've been trained as a scientist to do this. I just wonder if you had words of advice for this amazing community that is maybe thinking they could go some extra step, but they're not, for very personal reasons. I just wonder whether either words of encouragement or advice in suddenly jumping off the cliff and kind of daring to do things a different way. What advice might you give to young researchers, or maybe some of the old ones who still have another 15 years in the tank, to be part of radical change over the next decade rather than cautious contribution?
Yeah, well, I guess the textbook says I should be entering the phase of my life where I become cantankerous and bitter and cynical. I think that's what happens to 60-year-old academics. But I've reinvented myself. I've not regretted 1 minute of it. I wake up in the morning with a spring in my step. I feel that everything I do is very meaningful. I wonder why I didn't do it sooner. And maybe that's the message. Do it sooner. Do it. You only live once. So follow your passion. But it's difficult, because you don't fit the norm. You rub up against structures in university, you rub up against promotion metrics, you rub up against research evaluation frameworks. You don't quite fit. But I still say do it, because it's really important. Why should you not do something that's meaningful with your one life on this earth? But seek support mechanisms, because you'll feel very isolated, perhaps in your own institution, because you're a lone voice. Seek support mechanisms, build networks around you, support each other, which is why it's a shame we can't all meet in person, because we can do that over a coffee. In Bristol this week, we can support each other and keep each other going and encourage each other and galvanise ourselves for another year of being an oddity in your organisation. So I think that's what I would do.
Yeah, Gordon, thank you for that. And maybe that's something we all need to reflect on, is how ICT4S, it is an interesting point of connection, but maybe also a point of ambition. Where are the what could be the big risks that collectively we are putting messages out or communicating in different ways? So I hope people listening in have been, certainly like me, inspired both by your kind of personal journey and the new insights and outlook and the fire in your belly with that soft Scottish lilt that you have. So Gordon, thank you very much.